Hello, it is August 1st, 2020. This is Kathleen Newman from Maine Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for our program today, The Great Upheaval of 1675 to 1725, How Wars, Rebellions, and Refugee Crises Shaped Early America. For those of you that are joining us, if you have questions for our panelists today, you can type those questions using the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring those questions throughout the morning. Also, please be aware that this program is being recorded and that it will be shared on our website for everyone to enjoy later at mainhistory.org. So I would like now to introduce our coordinator for the workshop this morning, Ian Saxene. Ian Saxene has his PhD from Northwestern University, and he teaches U.S. history and British Atlantic world history at Bridgewater State University. His research focuses on colonial and Native American history, especially in New England, and his first book, Properties of Empire, Indians, Colonists, and Land Speculators on the New Frontier, was published, I think, just last year. Ian did his book launch with us at Maine Historical Society, and he is our coordinator for our Historians Forum programs like this. So I'm going to now turn it over to Ian, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Welcome all. Thanks in particular to not only Kathleen Newman for running the background, the logistics here, Jamie Rice, who runs the library, and the rest of the Maine Historical Society for hosting this event. Of course, thanks to our talented group of scholars who I'll be introducing in a moment, and to all of you who have chosen to join us here today. So the audience of those of you in the audience who are genealogists or members of the general public know how wonderful a resource the Maine Historical Society, its library, its museum, and the Longfellow House are. But the MHS is also a valued destination for scholars. And it seems fitting that the interested public get to see some of what goes on in the process of turning research at the MHS and other institutions into an argument and hopefully into meaningful knowledge for a broader public. And so this is our way of sort of giving you a behind the scenes look at how historians work to craft an argument on these topics. So my friend and colleague, my co-editor, Kristalyn Shefveland, and I, we began conversations 2 summers ago about a topic that historians love to argue over, and that is periodization. And so debates, for example, relevant to you folks, people make arguments that the 1960s really began with the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, or with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or with JFK's assassination, right? And of course, how somebody chooses to interpret the start of the 60s depends on what they think the 60s represent, right? It's what sort of spirit or ethos, or what's important to take away from this, right? And so historians are, of course, engaged in sort of large and small debates over periodization to think about relating different events and groups of people together with each other over time and space. And so what this project, the Great Upheaval Book Project is it's doing 2 things. One is we are telling a series of interesting historical narratives in and of themselves. But then we are also weaving these together to make a larger argument about how we think about early North America and its place in the broader Atlantic world, and indeed the early modern world in general. And so colonial American historians have generally talked about colonial American history, especially among English speakers, dividing it up in this sort of rough schematic right here. First, they describe the early years of colonization, all the way through the late 1600s, so this early colonies becoming established, okay, from relatively small incursions and then gradually growing in population. Okay, then scholars frequently talk about a provincial era, as they call it, from usually roughly 1688 and the entry of the British Empire into European sort of imperial global wars. And this provincial era lasts until roughly 1760. Okay, and it is described as a period of steady economic and population growth among English-speaking colonists, including the many enslaved people who they involuntarily brought with them into their territories. This period of time, the provincial era, is described as having sort of gradually a time of gradual sophistication in terms of colonial society and its economic life and its stratification. Increased prosperity for some colonists and happiness with the position of these colonies within the British Empire. And then the last dozen years or so before the American Revolution is the sort of colonial crisis, when the empire comes tumbling down and these colonists, as everybody learns in high school, protest taxation without representation and all the rest. Okay, so Kristalyn and I and these and the scholars we've been speaking to, we don't think that this is a particularly useful division. It in fact obscures as much as it explains, because of the awkward shoehorning of this sort of provincial designation to fit a lot of different events and times and places that are in fact not alike. And so this describing significant population and economic growth among English-speaking colonists, that really happens into the second and third decades of the 18th century. And instead, what we realized is that in the late 17th and early 18th century, from roughly 1675 to 1725, that there was, in fact, the story was not one of sort of steady growth of these colonies or clearly emerging prosperity, but rather of violence, of upheaval, of revolutions and struggles for liberation, of migrations and diasporas. Okay, and these sort of events, a number of which may be familiar to many of you in the audience, events like the Salem witch trials, King Philip's War, the dynamic spread of horse culture and increasing indigenous centers of power on the North American Great Plains, the emergence of a so-called golden age of piracy, featured by people like Blackbeard and Black Bartholomew Roberts, right? And so all of these kinds of events get framed in this older narrative as just sort of interruptions. And then, okay, yes, the Salem witch trials happened, but moving on, this is a time of growth and stability. And so instead, what we argue is that all of this disruption, in fact, makes more sense being analyzed together unto itself. And so that this half century between 1675 and 1725 should be considered as a whole and its own era, which we have decided to call the Great Upheaval. We are hoping it sticks. Feel free to use that. So we should add here, right, so this project is making this argument that we should really be changing how we talk about early America and the Atlantic world. And as you'll see, centering the violence and the movement and the disruption across much of the early modern world at this time shows how it was the violence of the Great Upheaval that created the conditions that later enabled a boom that some people enjoyed in English-speaking North America and elsewhere, that featured the sort of global economic interconnectedness, facilitating a greater exchange of goods and ideas, also of people, both voluntary migrants from Europe to North America, but also increasingly huge numbers of involuntary enslaved persons from Africa. And so all of this, the situations that scholars accurately describe as the 18th century, the sort of provincial era, happened because of this earlier era of Great Upheaval. Okay, and so the Great Upheaval, it had, we argue, 4 components. Okay, so it's important to clarify just for a moment here what we are arguing and what we are not, right, what this is, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. Okay, so the Great Upheaval was not a single event, okay, but it was a period of interrelated tumults that touched lives from the Rhine to the Rocky Mountains. Okay, an era of wars, rebellions, and migrations extending across the Atlantic world and much of North America. 4 overlapping factors drove the upheaval. The first is the maturation of European empires that were connecting the Atlantic world. and stepped up elite attempts within those empires to impose a more hierarchical society based on some combination of race, religion, and class. And examples of this phenomenon include King Philip's War in New England, Pope's Rebellion in New Mexico, Bacon's Rebellion in the Chesapeake, which we're going to hear about today, as well as the actions of numerous Caribbean pirates. Second, there was a more forceful indigenous reaction to destabilization of the North American interior due to this European penetration. Examples include the climax of the Iroquois Mourning Wars, the rise of horse culture on the Great Plains, including the Shoshone and Comanche ascendancy, the explosion in southeastern slave raids, indigenous wars against Carolina aggression, as well as border wars in what became the state of Maine. The third factor was a pair of titanic clashes between most nations in Europe that involved all of the major Atlantic overseas powers, drawing in their colonies and their indigenous neighbors into the fight. And finally, the reaction to these wars, both sort of opportunistic, for example, pirates, and defensive, so indigenous powers and colonists in the North American Northeast and Southeast, struggled to adjust to changing balances of power. And these reactions also included several major migrations and diasporas, including the Susquehannock and the Huguenot French Protestants from Europe. So this volume argues that, right, these interrelated episodes deserve to be understood together, that after 1725, overseas empires in the Atlantic world featured more rigidly centered hierarchies, okay? And a greater element of stability benefiting some. Okay? At the same time, this Atlantic world was more interconnected than ever before, exchanging people, ideas, and good in unprecedented volumes. And finally, this rise accompanied and boosted an Anglophone military and commercial ascendancy at sea, and a corresponding demographic ascendancy in North America. And this included the post-1713 boom in the transatlantic slave trade. So the chronological bookends of the crisis, why did we choose, or sorry, the upheaval, when did we choose this? Okay, approximately 1675, there was a cluster of events that served as a pretty useful sort of starting gun, including the Barbados slave conspiracy, the Susquehannock War that triggered Bacon's Rebellion, Pope's arrest for witchcraft in New Mexico, and King Philip's War all broke out within about a year of each other. And then this period of disruption sort of brought itself to a close with a series of, in the 1720s, including a series of North American treaties ending border wars, waning of slave raids in regions like the American Southeast, and a dramatic reduction in Atlantic piracy. So not every single person experienced, or region, I should say, experienced violence for the entire period, nor are we saying that these events followed the same pattern everywhere. But we are arguing that it was all this disruption that meant that the later events after the 1720s belong in a sort of very different category of analysis of sort of increased British military and fiscal supremacy that did not have before this Great Upheaval. Okay, and finally, this volume will focus on the diverse peoples of early modern North America and the Caribbean, and to place their experiences in the appropriate context. Several of our volume's contributors are going to examine events occurring across the Atlantic in several imperial metropoles in European locations, including Scotland, but as well as Habsburg, Spain, the King Louis XIV's France, and then the British Empire as well. And we will also be bringing in the West African coast into the consideration at this important time. Our framing of an early modern America in this volume is intentional, and the scholars already use it to describe this hero of North American history outside of the United States, and it places this book in conversation with the wider Atlantic world scholarship. And like the vast early America conceptual framing that a number of you in the audience might be familiar with, this encourages readers to draw wider connections between places, and peoples, while avoiding the pitfalls of limiting our gaze to the borders of the future United States. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. So we have, the way our schedule is going to look is we're going to have 3 speakers in a row. Kristalyn Shefveland, Celine Carayon, and Craig Gallagher are going to give us each speak for approximately 15 minutes about their topics. And we're going to take a 5-minute intermission. And then Jamie Goodall is going to talk about piracy. And she will be joining us shortly, and I will be speaking about the what became the state of Maine. And then we will take another 5-minute break, and then we will move over to an all participant panelist, in which we'll be responding to one another, as well as the many, no doubt, thoughtful questions we expect to be receiving from you. So our panelists today and their topics. Kristalyn Shefveland, my co-editor of this volume, will be speaking about Indian massacres, servants' revolts, and the transformation of Virginia. She teaches at University of Southern Indiana, and her most recent book is Old Florida, Yankee Settler Memory in the Land of the A's and the Seminole. Celine Carayon of Salisbury University is going to be speaking today about the French America, Indigenous America, a crisis in the Great Lakes region. And her most recent book is Eloquence Embodied, Nonverbal Communication Among French and Indigenous Peoples in the Americas, which you should definitely check out. And then third and far from least, Craig Gallagher, who teaches at New England College. He will be speaking today about Scotland's failed imperial venture and the surprising far-reaching consequences that it had. And he has a forthcoming book that you should be on the lookout for called Imperial Zealots, Scots and the Rise and Fall of British North America. That will, we hope, be out with the University of Virginia Press in 2021. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my esteemed co-editor, Kristalyn Shefveland.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Ian, for that introduction. So when I think about this time period, and I think about it as a time of peace and prosperity in Virginia, my immediate question becomes, for whom? When the Susquehannock War ended in 1675, the white settlers, the enslaved, and indigenous peoples of the Chesapeake became immersed in an ongoing and violent struggle for power that had been taking place for quite some time, but it got worse. Beginning with the cataclysmic events of Bacon's Rebellion, the upheaval that ensued sent shockwaves over the next 50 years. Bacon's Rebellion, of course, does not lend itself to simple explanation, as it embodied issues of race, class, and gender. But the tensions between violence and trade, especially as both shaped the legal and extra-legal Indian slave trade, led to and survived the events of 1675 to 1677. What I'd like to do today is move away from the events that have dominated the literature on the region and instead explore how 2 seemingly peripheral regions and events were shaped by the dualism of trade and violence. In the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, the Occaneechi worked to maintain and in some cases regain control over the interior in the wake of the violent attacks on their settlements. And as Virginia traders sought to move beyond the Blackwater and expand their trade into the Southwest. William Byrd I traded extensively south and west and frequently wrote of the threat to the English posed by hostile Indians, not considering the role his own trade in guns and slaves had in the upheaval. In an incident set to circumvent rival trader Abraham Wood's power in the interior, Byrd allegedly executed 7 native men connected to Wood, accusing them of murder, then took their wives and children and sold them. Highlighting Byrd's influence and growing influence in the colony, Governor Lord Francis Howard appointed Byrd as commissioner to the Seneca, who were raiding in Virginia in November 1683. That fall, a Seneca raiding party took several captives from Virginia tributaries. Byrd quickly took advantage of his position to bolster his own political aspirations and arranged for a treaty with the Seneca in Albany. And then in 1685, he went north again to negotiate for a lasting peace. He referenced the theft of one Indian girl and 3 Appomattox boys of one English settler, and Byrd demanded of the Haudenosaunee to renew the covenant chain and deliver up all Christian, Indian, and African servants and slaves that are amongst you. Lasting peace was not to be. In 1689, Byrd complained that his traders were having a hard time in the interior. 2 were killed, several lost their horses, and upheaval led other traders to leave their goods abroad. He was concerned about Indian attacks when he wrote about several strange Indians near his plantation that caused him alarm. A month later, he wrote to merchant Arthur North that the Indians on the periphery were, quote, very troublesome, and killed daily a number of cattle and hogs, and had occasionally shot at some of the colonists. In 1690, he wrote to London suppliers Perry and Lane that while he was well stocked with goods, he had a hard time trading since the Indians were, quote, at war with each other and troubles on all hands. This statement, again, does not consider Byrd's own role in the upheaval, but it is very likely that the increased gun trade and demand for Indian slaves likely led to the attacks and war throughout their region, as well as encroachment upon native land. Indian warfare disrupted colonial trade, and this is central to understanding the Virginia colonial world. Traders like Byrd actively sought the chaos of the Indian slave trade for profit. Haudenosaunee mourning wars, on the other hand, affected Byrd's bottom line. Even tributary Indians understood the complex geopolitics of the trade and shared the anxieties of their English neighbors, particularly as Haudenosaunee people ranged south. In the peripheral settlements, where large numbers moved through on their raids south, both the settlers and tributaries lived in a state of anxiety and fear. William Byrd I considered this to be a major threat to the colony. Despite his efforts in Albany, or perhaps because of them, Byrd felt especially concerned by the threat. On April 26, 1689, false alarms raised in Stafford and Rappahannock counties told of a plot by the French and 10,000 Seneca to attack the region. Several colonists responsible for the alarm were later jailed. On July 25, 1690, Byrd wrote to his relative, Daniel Horsmanden, and friend Nordis Rand, about a man killed by unknown Indians. In Stafford County, near the Piscataway settlements on June 15, 1694, George Mason reported to the council that non-tributary Indians killed an African slave near Brenttown. Mason related that he persuaded the English colonists to return to their settlements after the alarm, but felt that a local militia of rangers was necessary to maintain order. The council agreed, and in 1695, other rangers requested tributary Indian assistance in their pursuit of a James River Indian accused of killing an Englishman, calves, and hogs. They promised to pay tributaries in arms and ammunition for their assistance. Towards the northern regions of the Virginia colony, Stafford County deserves a little more of our attention. Piscataway claims to the region of the Potomac River Valley predate the colonial period. However, the Virginians felt that the Piscataway should live within the bounds of Maryland, and Maryland colonists agreed, seeking to confine the Piscataway to reservations as early as 1668. Colonial responses to the Piscataway provide insights into the colonial response to Indigenous movements in Stafford County, a colonial settlement northwest of the center of Jamestown. Now, issues with Native peoples and the alleged threat of violence to settlers emerged in Stafford County as early as March 1692, when reports come into James City from Stafford of daily alarms and of the sight and sign of Indians, and that the residents are in daily fears that if the Indians cannot fright them off their plantations, they will use other methods. We frequently hear from Captain George Mason, Commander-in-Chief of the militia of Stafford County. He says repeatedly about the miscarriage of justice. He talks repeatedly about issues with Maryland. And as the summer of 1697 unfolds, colonists begin to claim injury at the hands of the Piscataway in great detail. Mason will report to the council about an incident involving the severe injury to one William Wigington, his wife, and their 3 children. And the council will decide that they have to raise a militia. Once charges are brought against the accused Piscataway in Stafford County in October of 1697, 4 Piscataway are cleared of the charges and 1 is executed for the crime. 2 days later, the House of Burgesses again hears reports regarding the Piscataway. Stafford County asked the House of Burgesses to consider these Indians a grave threat to the colony. Problems are only starting to begin. In April 21st, 1699, George Mason pops up once again, and in the meeting with the Piscataway headmen, Piscataway indicated that they desired to be at peace with all but the French allied Indians. And it is here we start to see some of the major themes of the era once again. Great fear, great rumor of Haudenosaunee, and threats of violence from French allied groups moving south along the trade routes. Mason reported the Piscataway lived in 18 cabins on a sparse island with 20 men, 20 women, 30 children, estimating that there were probably about 80 to 90 bowmen total. Later that year, he starts to describe that the Piscataway lived in great fear of a group they called the Widowbees, and that the Widowbees might follow them and cause great mischief. Another violent event takes place in Stafford County in April 1700. Mason explains that on Sunday, April 16th, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, about 20 or 30 Piscataway allegedly went to Thomas Barton's house. Barton, his wife, and brother were not at home, but they had left their 3 children and an orphan boy, a man, his wife, and 3 children from another plantation to look after the house. According to Mason, the Piscataway descended upon the homestead, killing everyone except the orphan boy, who managed to run away and gather a small group. It was described as the horriblest attack that they had ever seen. The perpetrators, of the slaying were not captured, and eventually the majority of the Piscataway ended up moving to the Susquehanna River near Conestoga after a smallpox epidemic decimated their population. Smallpox pops up in another document in another area that I'd like to pay just a little bit of attention with my remaining time. Shifting our attention back to the southern perimeter, in the fall of 1697, a number of Occaneechi killed a Carolina trader, Robert Stevens, traveling through Virginia. The colonists questioned the suspected killers at Appomattoxtown, but after the suspects left, a group of, quote, strange Indians killed the suspected Occaneechi. This death led to one of William Byrd's traders, Richard Traunter, to pen a journal that lends insight into the Occaneechi in the trade, the rearrangement of power after Bacon's rebellion, especially the role of English traders moving into the Catawba territory, and as well the disease epidemics that are moving through the region. So Traunter was an established trader. He understood and spoke the language of the Tuscarora, the Wateree, and the Waxhaw, among others. There are 2 journals from his travels through the interior in 1698 and 1699. Traunter writes extensively of the disposition of the inhabitants of making peace. And in his introduction, he makes it quite clear that his motivations came from a natural desire to travel, but also to provide information for traders on how to get to Carolina safely. The latter was a direct result of the murder in 1697 of Stevens, but Traunter's also writing this for a wide audience. The way that he writes this means, when you take a look at it, it's clear that it was destined for publication, and his language is quite superfluous to that extent. But one of the things that we see, Traunter leaves with 4 other traders who, by his estimation, had, quote, more courage than the rest, 12 men total in his party, and his journal spoke frequently of their fear of attack and death by the Southern Indians as they set out from Appomattox. Traunter, for his part, has a lot of braggadocio as he's speaking, spoke firmly of the need to show strength when confronting Indians, as they would respect them more if they showed courage. While they saw signs of Indian traps for beaver and otter along the way, they did not get close to the Occaneechi town until August 30th. On the trip there, however, in one incident, one of the traders discharged a gun at night to scare off any prospective Indians, even though they hadn't actually seen anyone. And at this point, he saw a lesson for the traders, saying, "I could not forbear laughing at the traders and told them that I hoped they were now sensible how Indians might be managed, provided a man be not afraid of them." When Tronter encounters the Occaneechi, he spoke directly to them about the rumors his traders brought with him about the threats to various allied Indians of Byrd, including Indian Jack and one man named Eno Will. The Eno Will story is of some interest because what Tronter's trying to do with Eno Will is he takes him with him down into the Occaneechi territory, and he gives him this document that he calls a Sokahik, which he was describing as making him the king of the Occaneechi. What's particularly interesting to me about this document, and again about this idea of this being an era of prosperity, is Tronter is acting within this document as if the Sokahik is actually giving Eno Will power, but then we see when Eno Will actually takes it to the Occaneechi basically laugh him off and rip it up and kick him out of the territory. And so Tronter alleges throughout the first journal that he has the upper hand, but by the time that we get into the second journal, we see that the Occaneechi are not playing into his game. But as we see with the Piscataway in my earlier discussion, the Occaneechi are also going to be decimated by a smallpox epidemic. And so this era is an era of extensive trade. This is an era of extensive Indian slave trade, an era of great upheaval, so to speak. And the events that I've spoken about a little bit this morning remind us that violence and trade are never far apart from one another and constantly present in this early Chesapeake region, this early trade region for both settlers and natives alike. That's not even to speak to what's going on with enslaved Africans during this period as well. And so this is a turbulent era, an era of a frontier exchange economy with rumors and paranoia about Indigenous violence. This is an era where they are trying to move into this plantation economy. But I would remind you that when they are building Westover, when Byrd II is building Westover, he's still building tunnels so that he would be able to escape should there be a native attack upon his plantation on the James River. And I will cede my time, and I look forward to talking more in the discussion later today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Celine, you are up next, so take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I want to thank Ian and Kristalyn for inviting me, and of course the Maine Historical Society for kindly hosting today. So in the late summer of 1701, the French colonial authorities in Montreal accomplished something quite extraordinary through skillful and lengthy diplomatic negotiations that owed both to European and Indigenous traditions. Something that was quite of an anomaly in the midst of several decades of devastating violence and crises, as we've been discussing so far. They concluded a very large, very complex, very successful and lasting peace treaty with numerous Indigenous nations that had previously been at odds with each other and with the French across an immense territorial expanse and in the middle of a smallpox epidemic. This event is known as the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701. It was finalized in August of that year. And it was a multinational treaty concluded between the French colonial authorities and really several constituencies, the church, the nobility, influential members of the merchant class in Montreal, and of course officials, colonial officials in New France, and 40 different Indigenous nations. The representatives, the ambassadors that came from those Indigenous nations came from as far south as Missouri, and as far north as west of Lake Superior, northwest of Lake Superior, from Iroquois to Acadia, and the St. Lawrence Valley, of course. So the main purpose of this treaty and its most significant outcome was to stop the devastating wars that had opposed for decades French colonists and their indigenous allies east and south of the Great Lakes to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The treaty was part of France's imperial plan to impose a Pax Gallica among all of their indigenous allies and trade partners, and further expand their imperial oversight into the North American continent and down the Mississippi Valley, which had been explored and claimed all the way to the Gulf of Mexico just a couple years prior to that treaty. So the main long-term result of the Great Peace of Montreal is that the five-nation Iroquois Confederacy maintained a policy of neutrality from 1701 all the way to the start of the 7 Years' War in 1754. This, in effect, put a stopper to a half-century of mutual raids between indigenous nations and the French and English allies in that region. So it was, of course, a really great accomplishment. So if this is an instance of peace and an instance of success, and it's been hailed as a great example of intercultural diplomacy during that time, I believe that it's very relevant to the study of the role of empires in fostering violence and social change, which is one of the key questions at the heart of this volume. And what really interests me in this volume is the idea that the era of the Great Upheaval, that concept of the Great Upheaval as an era, can really help us reconceptualize the peace of Montreal, the Great Peace of Montreal, in interesting ways. The peace itself was, of course, made necessary by tremendous violence that had unfolded for decades east of the Mississippi and in lands and borderlands claimed by the French as a direct result of the many pressures brought about by settler colonialism and the combination of trade and settlement and shifting alliances, of course, and imperial competitions between the main imperial powers. So the French, in other words, were really instrumental in the making of the crisis that they were trying to stop through the Great Peace of Montreal. I think the volume, like I said, offers opportunities to reframe the event in several ways, because the way it's been treated so far in the historiography has really kind of obscured a little bit the way the real underlying causes and the experiences of other groups. I had some slides and some images and maps for you, but I don't think I'm able to share them at this time, so I apologize for that. I'll try to be specific in my description. So the treaty negotiations are thankfully well documented. We have official reports and narrative accounts of the negotiations by several French chroniclers, Claude Charles Leroy de la Poterie, Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix. We have the actual treaty that's very well preserved, that bears pictographic signatures or plan marks from many of the indigenous representatives that were present. We also have extensive colonial correspondence, both on the French side and on the English side, leading up, of course, in many decades leading up to that event. We have missionary accounts. A lot of the missionaries also served as interpreters. And more significantly, and what's really interesting about this event, is that we have speeches of indigenous diplomats that were recorded in the meeting minutes quite specifically by scribes. And so we lose a lot of the style, we lose some of course, the I guess the details of those speeches, but we do have the essence of the messages, and very often they're quite assertive and quite critical of the imperial agenda of the French, and kind of give us a lot of insights, interesting insights into what the various indigenous nations that participated really were trying to achieve, and what motivated them in joining the French in Montreal in the summer of 1701. So in the last decades of the 17th century, just to outline a little bit, again, it would be easier with a map, but I'm going to try to describe this for you. We have several leagues. So on the one side, we have the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is in Upper New York State, allied with the Covenant chain inherited from the Dutch to the English, especially in the New York colony and beyond. they are opposed more or less throughout the 17th century to the French and their own Indian allies. The French are originally allied with a lot of Algonquian nations along the St. Lawrence and in eastern Canada, the Penobscot, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, the Passamaquoddy, and other Algonquian groups like the Montagnais and the Algonquins. But mostly after the 1660s, the French are really expanding into the Great Lakes region, and they create a new league with the Hurons, Pitans, Potawatomis, Ojibwas, Ottawas, Foxes, Kickapoos, Nipissings, Winnebagos, and Sacs all around the Great Lakes region. They also strike a pretty fragile alliance with the Dakota Sioux in 1695, and the Covenant chain. So that's that. Sorry, I'm trying to monitor the chat as well, and it's not working for me. Okay, so what made this piece, the Great Peace of Montreal, so great, and why have we looked at it, and how has it been kind of framed so far? First, of course, its scale, right? Rather than being understood as a single event, the Great Peace of Montreal is best understood as a process of diplomatic negotiations that lasted months. It really mobilized an incredible amounts of wealth, time, and human energy, not just in Montreal, but all across the Northeast and the Great Lakes during the first half of 1701. And this was not a smooth process. It was interrupted constantly by rumors, by fears, by an epidemic of smallpox that cost the lives of several Indigenous ambassadors and their people. But still, the negotiations were on a very large scale. The peace gathered an estimated 1,300 representatives from 40 different Indigenous nations. There were hundreds of speeches made, a dazzling amount of gifts and wampum belts exchanged during those times, and especially a large amount of captives. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on. I think that's one of the most interesting and telling part of this event is actually the exchange and the return of war captives. That tells us another story about the decades leading up to the Great Peace of Montreal and what type of upheavals communities in those regions had experienced during that time. The Great Peace of Montreal is also great because it ushered a new phase in the construction of France's overseas empires. In effect, by securing a lasting peace among French and Indigenous allies, it opened up to the French commerce and missions and settlement, what the French called the Pays d'en Haut, which was the area around the Great Lakes, also the Illinois country, the Mississippi River Valley, and like I said, all the way down to Louisiana, where the French founded Fort Maurepas around those years too, in 1699. Scholars have actually hailed the Peace of 1701 as more significant for French history than the better known and more often celebrated Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, which concluded the War of Spanish Succession and incidentally took Acadia, the Hudson Bay, and Newfoundland away from New France. But in 1701, Louis XIV is really inaugurating a new official imperial policy in North America. He's explicitly aiming at stopping Western expansion by English settlers by creating this immense network of Indigenous allies that would serve as almost an impassable and unreachable defense wall against that expansion into those places. So in effect, the Treaty of Montreal made the French, at least on paper, and I want to stress that, masters of the heart of the North American continent, all the way from the St. Lawrence, like I said, to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this is their vision. This is what they are hoping to create. And I think historians have been really constricted by this kind of positive narrative that was constructed in the colonial sources. This event did not completely end the violence. It did not completely transform the nature of Euro-Indian relations. even though it did maintain, like I said, some peace and the neutrality of the Iroquois up to the French and Indian War. So there's been excellent scholarship around this piece, but it's been mostly studied as an impressive feat of intercultural diplomacy. In my own book, I dedicate part of a chapter to that piece, but mainly I focused on the type of mediation that we see in Montreal and explain how it was only made possible by 2 centuries of communication and interaction among French and Indigenous peoples, and how they formed this community of interpretation and were able to mingle, kind of to speak the same language, right, broadly conceived, with mutually understood signs and symbols to go beyond their lasting linguistic and cultural differences. But I think there's an opportunity here to rethink and to rethink the event and go beyond this rather Western-centric view of North American geopolitics and geography. Clearly, Indigenous nations had communication networks that went way beyond what the French considered to be their imperial playground. And so the alliance networks that stretch in areas settled and coveted by the French, I believe, were expanded much further beyond that. So I think we have much to gain in taking a step back and placing the Great Peace in a more transnational context, in a larger chronological view, and trying, of course, to continue to recover further Indigenous agendas, voices, and processes. As much as it would be, and it was easier for the French chroniclers to think of participants in the piece as members of clean-cut political identities, it is clear that by the turn of the 18th century, Indigenous nations were in deep flux. And I think we need to really question who was there and what experience those groups were going through during that time. So for instance, after the height of the Iroquois wars against the Hurons in 1649 and 50, the Hurons had been almost destroyed and were forced to join force with the Pitans. But they regain domination and they regain some influence through those new alliances after the 1650s. And again, we're kind of turning that around, that situation around, by the time we get to the Peace of Montreal in 1701, thanks to those alliances. But this was a world of refugees. And this part, I think, has been significantly neglected by scholars. For instance, between 1665 and 1680, when France was expanding the alliance territorially in the Great Lakes region, this caused the fighting against the Iroquois to really multiply and expand in scale. By 1671, Charlevoix tells us that the Miamis and the Potawatomis had rifles, and those conflicts not only increased the death rate, but they also especially led to the taking of more captives during that time. So for instance, in 1696, a raid by the Ottawas and Potawatomis against the Senecas killed perhaps as many as 70 Indigenous people, but it led to the capture of 30 Seneca or warriors. It's extremely hard to trace those captives after they've been taken, but we know through the Peace of Montreal, because so many captives are being exchanged and returned, that basically all those communities are home to many displaced people, to many incorporated people. And I think it would be very interesting to look further into what different types of captives we have in there, what different types of situations we have. Because we also have refugee Iroquois who have sought refuge in French missions, in French Catholic missions like Kanawake. And so we really have multicultural, multilingual communities that are really struggling to face the challenges brought about by settler colonialism and extending imperialism during that time. most of the peace talks involves the return of captives, like I said. In one instance, the Hurons mentioned in their speeches that they were presenting, quote, 12 prisoners, of which 5 want to go back with us, so they want to stay with the Hurons. For the 7 others, you may do as you please with them. Chichicatalo, chief of the Miamis, also pointed out, I obeyed you, my father. He's talking to Nuncio, the name given by indigenous people to the French governor, in bringing back 8 Iroquois prisoners, although I do not see any of mine, his people, who are among the Iroquois. So there's also a lot of indication in those treaty minutes that a lot of groups are really eager to recover some captives and the members of their communities as well. And this kind of, I think, adds a layer of complexity to the way we've described indigenous captivity patterns and the integration of captives in those communities as well. So wins by the Western nations in the last years of the 17th century had resulted in a massive amount of Iroquois captives being incorporated, adopted into, but also subjugated among various nations. During a conference in Michilimackinac in 1695, the French commander Lamotte de Cadillac had commented, quote, let us think once again, not only of making war, but of continuing it until the very common enemy, speaking about the Iroquois, is entirely destroyed. Since it began, your villages have grown bigger, your cabins are filled with children and with beautiful youth. Now, this is interesting because it testifies of the losses experienced by the Haudenosaunee during that time, which also pushed them to accepting the terms in 1701. It hints at the cultural and social changes experienced within distant indigenous communities. By 1699, the Iroquois are reported by English sources to be really on the brink of complete destruction, which causes English settlers a great deal of fear, not just in Albany and the surrounding area, but actually in much more distant places. So I think what I'd like to do, if given the opportunity, what I'd like to do with this chapter is really to look more at what that Iroquois diaspora looked like. In what ways those displacements, those massive displacement and upheavals experienced by people during those years leading up to the peace, in what ways did that contribute to the type of indigenous agendas and motives that we see that are reflected in the sources at the peace of 1701? We also have 19th century oral traditions collected in the 19th century, but Ojibwe and Huron oral tradition that could also help us understand better how this is not, the piece does not really determine or characterize the nature of this era. This era is mostly characterized as an era of displacement and terrible destruction of place, of community, and of resources during that time. So I'll leave it at that, but I think, again, that the context of the Great Upheaval might allow us to ask new questions and shed a new light on the Great Peace of Montreal and the events leading up to it and following it. And I'm looking forward to pursuing this further. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Celine. All right, and next up we have Craig Gallagher talking about Scotland and its imperial ambitions. Take it away, Craig.
Thank you, Ian. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I just want to thank Ian and Kristalyn and the Maine Historical Society for putting this on. I have been thinking about this chapter and the project ever since Ian first brought it up with me at a reception. I think it was at the NACBS, Ian. And when we talked about it, I was struck by the possibilities of the opportunity to reframe historiography in this way. I actually met Ian at an AHA panel a couple of years ago that we both did that came about because of a meeting with our co-panelists at the time where we had met because we both had an interest in this era as sort of understudied in American history. So there's a nice little synergy in the fact that I'm here today talking about 1675 to 1725 as this kind of crucial moment, not just in American history, but also European and Atlantic history. as I started writing my paper about what we titled Scotland's Failed Empire, I increasingly realized as I was thinking about it that I need to talk about this moment of Scottish Empire less as failed than as reimagined. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. But what I would really want to say at the beginning is what I think the value of this great upheaval idea is, that is rethinking American history, Atlantic history, imperial history through this third era in the middle between the early colonial and the more provincial later colonial era. And that is that I think it offers a really nice corrective to a tendency we have in history, in American history, to imagine the Atlantic world as this great moment or era in history of openness, of movement, of constant imperial boundary crossing, almost a kind of neoliberal world where state borders don't exist and people move around freely. And I think what the Great Upheaval is really useful for is it helps us to rethink ways in which that kind of idea of an open and free Atlantic world changed. In fact, I think it changed from that vision of a more open Atlantic world in the earlier part of the colonial era, especially the 17th century, to a more restrictive one by the end of the 18th. And I think roughly around 1725 is when you start to see that transformation. And personally, and this is partly why I think my chapter is such a good fit for what we're talking about here, I think you can really see that transition from the perspective not of the great imperial powers like England or France or Spain, but in fact from one of the smaller ones trying to make headway in the Americas as a colonizer, as an economic power. And of course, the small one I'm talking about is Scotland, the country of which I was born, but I've also done quite a bit of professional research. I think if you look at the era of the Atlantic world as we think of it from the Scottish perspective, you actually get a very different idea of how open and free the Atlantic world truly was. Because seeing it from that small European perspective is quite transformative. I think the era from roughly about 1675 to 1725 is a moment in time when a lot of new imperial possibilities are explored, not unlike the very early colonial era when countries like Sweden were colonizing in the New World. But it's also an era where you see a lot of these imperial possibilities quashed, squashed even, by the larger imperial powers seeking to assert their control over the era. In fact, you could almost talk about it as a transition moment from a more open Atlantic to a more closed Atlantic afterwards. I usually talk about it in my own work as a sort of growth and regulation of how the Atlantic world is regulated by Britain, by France, and by Spain after 1725. And some of this relates to my larger work, so I'd be happy to talk about it at the end. But for today, what I really want to do is look at the specific example of the Scottish attempt to found a colony on the Darian Isthmus in Panama. That is the very narrow isthmus, roughly geographically just south of the Panama Canal today, which was an attempt by the Scots, right happily actually in the middle of the Great Upheaval, roughly around 1698 to 1702. Where they attempted to create a colony that was part of what they saw as the new imperial world that had been created after the 1670s and 1680s, but in fact was crushed because of the reality of the world that was going to be created, the more closed and regulated Atlantic that would follow. And they didn't know that change was happening, of course. They experienced it in real time. But I think looking at their experience, we can get a sense of what was different about the world they built the colony in and the world in which it failed. So I took a slightly different tack, I think, from previous presenters, in that I'm not necessarily going to speak about individuals or specific stories, partly because I don't know how familiar folks really are with the Scottish Darian scheme. So I wanted to take a more broad outline and just tell you what it was, what was intended, what the history of Scotland that led to it was, and the kind of legacy of the event. I think in order to explain its relevance to a bigger imperial conversation that isn't just a story about Scotland or even a story about Panama or even the native peoples who lived there, but in fact is a story about kings and empires and successions, about economic policy, about the concept of what counts as a colony, and also a broader story about who controls the waterways and the passage across the Atlantic. It's a fairly isolated event in the history of the Atlantic world, but I think it's one with a lot of explanatory potential. So what was the Scottish Darian scheme? Possibly some of you already know, but in a sentence, it's an event famous in Scottish history for all the wrong reasons. Scottish people tend to talk about it as the Darian disaster. Sometimes you talk about it as the catastrophe. You know, I've written elsewhere that almost every time Darian is brought up, not just by Scots, but by English historians, American historians, even other European historians, everybody always puts ill-fated or disastrous or calamitous beforehand. It has this reputation as this kind of catastrophe in Scottish history. And part of the reason for that is for a very long time, the Darian scheme was associated with the end of Scotland's status as an independent country. The Darian scheme ultimately collapses in the year 1700. By 1707, Scotland has been united in royal union with England, parliamentary union, I should say, as one single nation of Great Britain. And of course, if you've been following the news at all for the last 5 or 6 years, the question of Scottish independence is back in the news. There was a referendum on it. It's back in the news today over Brexit. So talking about it as this moment in the history of Scottish independence has been the main way in which people talk about it. The Darian scheme itself was a state-backed project by Scotland as an independent kingdom to found a colony on the Isthmus of Panama. They had a couple of ambitions. The first was to create what they called the trade entrepot. In other words, a trading colony that would allow not only Scots to trade there, but actually to allow the ships of all nations to dock at their ports. Now, I should clarify that. It wasn't every single country. They would not allow countries they were at war with, and they had some reservations about allowing Catholic countries to trade there. They would much prefer, if they could, to trade with fellow Protestants, like the Dutch, like the English, like other North German, Scandinavian peoples. But the broader idea of an open-ended colony of trade that would welcome all merchants was very much the intention at the beginning. Their secondary intention was to create a missionary colony. They had a vision of creating an enclave of Presbyterianism, which was the dominant political faith, a confessional faith in Scotland in this era, right in the heart of Catholic Spanish America. So this idea of creating a space for Presbyterianism to convert the native peoples, to convert any Spanish colonists who might want to join, and hopefully to bring Presbyterians and Calvinists from elsewhere in Europe to come and join their colony. Both ambitions ultimately failed because the colony was undermined by disease, by poor planning on the part of the colonists and those back in the metropole who put the work into planning it, but also a broader Anglo-Spanish hostility to the existence of this Darian colony, which I'll talk about in a moment. But that imperial framework is pretty critical. So let me take a step back because I want to explain why the Darian colony became a thing in the first place. And to do that, I have to kind of think about the periodization of the Great Upheaval. And I think I'm about to be the first one to say that I'm thinking about this as a kind of long Great Upheaval, because the relevant date for my story is actually not 1675, but 1660, about 15 years earlier, when the restoration of King Charles II happened in the British kingdoms. Essentially, he was restored to the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland after the end of Oliver Cromwell's short-lived Commonwealth government. Now, the reason that date matters is because it was essentially the functional end of 2 decades of dominance in Scottish politics by the Presbyterian faction. Essentially, a group known as the Covenanters, who in the 1640s had risen up against Charles II's father, Charles I, over his attempts to change the religious orthodoxy of Scotland more towards his preferred Episcopal Anglicanism and away from their preferred Presbyterianism. Now, I'm really glossing over the real differences here because there were issues of politics, finance, and other issues. But for 20 years, the Presbyterians, even under Cromwell, had largely been the dominant faction. But when Charles II returned, he instructed his government in Scotland to essentially suppress Presbyterianism as the dominant faith. This was despite the fact that he had previously sworn an oath to uphold Presbyterianism. And so there was a lot of bad feeling, bad blood between him and the Presbyterians in Scotland. In 1666, just 6 years after he was restored, this led to an uprising against Charles II's government in Scotland. That failed. It was brutally suppressed. And for the first time, it led to a significant part of the Scottish Presbyterian community fleeing overseas in exile. Most of them went to the Dutch Republic, today's modern Netherlands, which, if you know your history of the Dutch Republic, was famous for its religious toleration and for bringing in exiles. In the case of the Scottish Presbyterians, they were also pretty closely religiously aligned with Dutch Calvinists, so there's a lot of reason for them to go there. Beginning roughly around the period of the Great Upheaval in 1674, you also start to see these Scottish Presbyterian exiles reaching out to New Englanders, to Puritans, both in Boston, but also in places like Connecticut and Rhode Island, because they also shared a kind of antipathy to the Anglicanism of Charles II, a kind of religious fraternity around a resistance to what they saw as sort of a popish, very top-down hierarchical religion favored by the king. The main reason I want to mention these Scots in exile is because for a very long time, beginning around 1675, they served as some of the most influential propagandists against King Charles in his own realms, because they were so critical of his choice of religious beliefs, his Episcopalianism, his Anglicanism, and they were also very critical of his intention to have his brother, James, Duke of York, a Catholic, inherit the throne. During the Popish plot, during the Exclusion Crisis, these Scots are some of the most vicious and prolific propagandists against the regime. There was a second attempt to overthrow King Charles's sort of new episcopal regime in Scotland in 1679. Again, that one failed and led to even greater persecution of Presbyterians. And this one really is the one that sparked a migration out to the Americas. A new generation of exiles moved to Boston, moved to the Carolinas, New Jersey, the city of Perth Amboy in New Jersey, founded by Scottish exiles during this era. There's this tradition already by the 1680s of Scots escaping or trying to move out into the New World to get away from political problems at home. I'll just note here that in some ways the Scots were on the right side of history when it came to British politics. Their criticisms of Charles II and James II, as he would later become when he became king in 1685, eventually became mainstream. The Glorious Revolution in 1689 saw James II overthrown in favor of William, Prince of Orange of the Dutch Republic. William, as you may know, became King William III because he married James's daughter, Mary II. He was most famous in Scotland for his close association with the Presbyterian minister William Carstairs, who was his personal chaplain, and who largely was responsible for the Scots restoring Presbyterianism to the dominant faith, the dominant political creed in Scotland after the Glorious Revolution. I should be clear that I'm sort of zooming through some of the broad contours of this, but I just want to point out that what this led to was a new conception of the British state after 1689. Scots began to think of themselves as part of the broader multiple what historians call the composite British monarchy, where they were an independent kingdom who nevertheless owed allegiance to a king who ruled over multiple countries. In the case of Prince William, he was the stadtholder of the Netherlands, which gave him a lot of political power. He was also the king of England and Ireland and king of Scotland, but he had different responsibilities in the minds of the Scots in his home in Scotland. In particular, one of his responsibilities was to defend Presbyterianism. Part of the reason they had rejected Charles II is he failed to do this. And so they have a very clear sense of themselves as a nation, but it's a nation that is almost a kind of Presbyterian commonwealth. It's not really like a lot of the political nation-building ideas that we tend to think of in most of the scholarship, the idea of secular states emerging. They really went the other way. They were thinking in terms of a kind of Presbyterian commonwealth where the faith was sort of the dominant part of how politics would work. And in fact, the 1690s was in many ways a kind of decade of innovation in Scotland, especially political innovation. You started to see things like the Bank of Scotland be founded, really modeled on the English equivalent. There were moves to increase Scottish access to European trade, to increase the Scottish presence in Ireland, to broaden out university education. Of course, for Presbyterians, being able to read and consume the Bible was critical. So education was a big part of their approach. But it was also an era where they embraced the idea of empire, of colonial empire in particular. And so a lot of Scots, for example, took up the cause of the English empire in North America. In the Caribbean, this is the era where a lot of Scots become essentially slave drivers on Caribbean plantations, because it was one of the best ways for them to get out there and start working in the New World and earn a living and eventually hopefully buy a plantation themselves. So, you know, a point to make here is that very early on, Scots are complicit in sort of expanding the British slave trade. But at the same time, the 1690s was also a decade of conflict with the English and with King William, because although Scots did not see a contradiction in fighting for King William against his French enemies. They saw him as their Protestant champion. They were happy to take up the sword and fight in Europe with him, and many, in fact, did do that. There was also a broader problem of England trying to forcibly conscript Scots that did not want to fight. This is the era of the press gang and impressment in Scottish ports, when the English would seize Scottish sailors and force them to sail on Royal Navy ships. Scottish ships that were essentially neutral, that were trading with, say, the Netherlands or France, were seized as contraband in violation of English navigation acts, that kind of thing. And so you started to see a degree of conflict happening between these two kingdoms as they thought of themselves as independent. All of this kind of leads to the broader financial problems caused by the war that lead to the Scots thinking of the Darian project as a possible way out. It was sort of a state-run project to try to give Scotland its own colonial empire, free from the English, free from this kind of oversight by William and his interests, in the hopes that it would lead to greater prosperity for the kingdom. It's a long story as to why they ended up on the Panama Isthmus. I'd be very happy to talk about it in more detail in the questions, but I'll just say that it was partly the brainchild of one man, William Patterson, who had spent a lot of time studying accounts of pirates and buccaneers who'd sailed in that area. He had this grand thesis that the area had been abandoned by the Spanish because they moved to nearby Cartagena in modern-day Colombia as a much more lucrative area, and Panama had essentially been left untouched. And when the colony was originally founded, they actually had an early vision of creating a port on either side of the isthmus and creating a kind of early Panama Canal where goods would be shipped across the isthmus by land, and they would sort of function as a way to connect the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. Unfortunately for them, almost right away, they ran into trouble. The Scots had envisioned their colony as a kind of equivalent to recent Danish, Dutch, and even Kurlander colonies. Kurland is a small kingdom in the extreme Baltic, northeast of Europe. Kurland actually owned the island of Tobago in this era. So there was a sense that small countries could form colonies and sort of create a kind of rich colonial legacy for themselves. Scotland wanted to do it along those terms, to create this kind of enclave for themselves. And they had an explicit ambition to ally with the local Indians, the local native peoples, known as the Thule, in the Panama Isthmus, because they saw those people as potential allies against the Spanish. You know, these Scots were very hardy believers in the idea of the Black Legend, where the Spanish were always sort of permanently persecuting the native peoples. So they thought that the Thule in particular would be extremely loyal and friendly allies to them. And partly that bore out, but that's an aside. I'll just note here that despite these ambitions, the project largely failed because of a combination of infighting amongst the initial colonists. Actually, there were two initial efforts to settle the isthmus about a year apart. By the time the second voyage from Scotland arrived in Panama, the first group had already abandoned the site because of issues to do with politics and a lack of food. And so that second expedition had to rebuild and really didn't get them off to a very good start. There was also the issuing of an explicit blockade by the English Parliament against the Scottish colony, because at the time in 1699, when it was getting off the ground, this colony potentially would upset the Spanish king, who at that moment in time was an ally of King William. King William III of England was trying to prevent the French Bourbons from ending up on the Spanish throne. He wanted to prevent Philip, the future Philip V of Spain, from seizing Spain from the aging King Carlos. And so he was trying to keep the Spanish happy. And to do that, he specifically blockaded and forbade English merchants from trading with the Scots, which massively undermined what the Scots had hoped to do. They wanted a port that would open its doors to basically all traders, but really the focus of their interests were English colonists in Jamaica, English colonists in places like Charleston and New York. So this was an enormous blow. And because William took the side of the Spanish, he also did not intervene when the Spanish king made a decision. And I should say by this point, King Carlos II was considered mentally unfit for the role. So this would have been a regency council that would have been making the decision. When the Spanish decided to militarily remove the colony, they sent an army, and for the record, a navy sent from Spain itself to extirpate it. The Scots appealed to the king for help, but King William was not interested. His interest was in maintaining this fragile alliance he had with the Spanish, because he was afraid that should it break, Spain would turn to France and ultimately join against him in a kind of greater Bourbon realm that he would have to contend with. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of scholarship on the idea that William, as King of England and Scotland, sacrificed the interests of his Scottish colonists to preserve a Spanish alliance. Unfortunately for William, the colony was destroyed by the Spanish, leading to a lot of hurt feelings on the part of his Scottish subjects. And then when King Carlos II of Spain died anyway, the throne passed to Philip of Bourbon. And so William was not ultimately successful in his attempts to stop the Spanish succession crisis going to the French claimant. The legacy of this, as you can imagine, was a lot of bitterness amongst the Scots because of their interpretation of themselves as a kind of religious commonwealth, a kind of independent country. They believed they had an absolute right to create their own colonial projects, but they also believed that the king had a duty to protect them against Catholics. You know, the real reason they were loyal to William was because of his status as a sort of Protestant champion of Europe. And the idea that he had taken the side of Spanish Catholics over them really embittered a lot of people towards him. They also accused him of favoring his English kingdom's interests over the Scottish kingdom, which absolutely he did, and frankly makes sense. The English kingdom was larger and much wealthier, but you can understand why that would bother them. It led to a kind of push for the Anglo-Scots Union for the first time as a way to resolve the competing interests of William's two kingdoms, and in particular, to head off the problem of multiple claims to sovereignty that existed within the British Isles. William, as you may know, died without a legal heir, and he was succeeded by Queen Anne, who was his wife's sister. Anne also had no legitimate male heirs after the death of her son in 1701. And so all of a sudden, Britain found itself in its own succession crisis. And among the reasons for the ultimate agreement of the Anglo-Scots Union in 1707 was the possibility, spoken about quite frequently in the sources, that the Scots were flirting with a Jacobite restoration, with the possibility of bringing back a Stuart who might be loyal to Presbyterianism because they were so dissatisfied with the English agreement, the English relationship at that point. Now, that never came to head, and ultimately the Anglo-Scots Union was agreed in 1707. It allowed the English to head off that succession crisis, but also gain manpower and support against France in their ongoing war with the Spanish succession. I'll just note here that it also allowed the Scots, for the first time, access to England's empire without any of the restrictions that had previously been imposed upon their ability to trade and move around. And so it was very much an opportunistic move for them as well. They gained full access to empire as British citizens. So that narrative was a little rushed, and I'd be happy to flesh out any of it if you have any questions. But I'll just kind of wrap this up by talking about how I think this story fits into the broader idea of the Great Upheaval and rethinking the periodization of early America and a kind of Atlantic era. Because really, these are the critical decades in Scottish history. If you want to understand where Scotland fit into the broader story of the Atlantic world, it's the period from 1660 to about 1730 that really matters. And not coincidentally happens to be the era that my dissertation really focused on. The book's going to go a little further, but that was the focus of my work. I like to talk about the Scots as having gone from eager but excluded participants in the broader idea of empire under Charles II. They were very determined to kind of create a strong state and travel around and engage with the colonies, but they were legally forbidden from doing so because of restrictions on Presbyterianism. Then they transitioned to a more complicated status as sort of subject but included, in the sense that they were subject to William and the broader idea, but they lacked the full rights of British subjects. And then finally, Britons themselves. They became what I call in the book imperial zealots, people who were not only full members of the empire, but actually full-blown zealots for that cause. In fact, Scots became some of the most enthusiastic British imperialists after 1707. And as I'm going to argue in my forthcoming book, and also in this chapter, they were in many ways responsible for the shift in priorities of the British Empire after 1707 towards a more exclusionary, restrictive model of who got to take part in the fruits of the British Empire. They would open their doors, for example, to Protestant refugees from Europe, for example, the Moravians, the German Palatines who settle in the 1710s in New York. They would open their doors to people from French Huguenot communities. These groups would be welcomed with open arms, but there would be a resistance to the idea of trading with French and Spanish merchants or traders, and so a kind of greater push for what we might think of as a traditional mercantilist idea of empire, restricting access from others. But at the same time, the Scots were careful to make sure that they benefited from the empire as well. This is the era of the rise of the Glasgow tobacco trade, the era of growing Scottish influence in the colonies, for example, the Livingston family of New York. You also see the growth of explicitly Scottish communities in the New World. For example, Cape Fear in North Carolina becomes a sort of explicitly, almost sort of homogeneously Scottish community in its first couple of decades. And because the Scots were such enthusiastic imperialists, they had totally transformed from these complicated outsiders trying to think of their nation as its own space into participants in an empire they now saw as something larger than the broader national idea that they had started with. So Darian was ultimately a failure, but it opened the door for them to reimagine themselves in a broader British empire, one that was explicitly Protestant, explicitly Calvinist, quite exclusionary against anyone who didn't fit that categorization. And really, it helped recreate the Atlantic world that they first of all considered a place that they had every right to travel out into, to build colonies in, to contribute to as equal and open citizens, into one where that definition of equality of access was really increasingly constrained up to the era of the American Revolution, which of course is only 50 years after the end of the period that we're talking about. So hopefully that made sense. I'd be happy to talk about any aspect of what I had to say here, but I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Craig, and to our other morning panelists. And we will be reconvening in just 5 minutes when Jamie Goodall will be talking about the sometimes called the golden age of piracy, and then I will be talking about the disturbances going on in what became the state of Maine, and then we will reconvene in an all-scholar roundtable after a quick break.